This is about the character Lewis's family. This is a really young guy. He's like 21. He's looking back on his life at this point, going a very own way. In this, he felt he was his namesake's son, in fact. His father had left home at 13, then left his aunt and uncle for good at 15, before bouncing around into a decade of adventures which sometimes still seemed to only give him a roguish delight, while remaining decorated only, Lewis realized, with the same few details. His pop was not one to go on and on about himself in the past. For years, he was genuinely not proud, and just as glad as if God would forgive and forget. But forget what? Unless he was excited about putting together a business plan for some land or a new restaurant or some possible partnership with someone he knew from church, that was generally a man of few words. He could have asked about most anything. He could be asked about most anything, though. He would still try to answer in as few words as possible. He was not usually as likely to talk as Mom. Lou's regret over dropping out of school in eighth grade seemed unlikely to repeat itself in Lewis, but then what new bar should be raised so that he gets how far to go so that he knows how far to go? Would everyone just find his immature comedy as stone cold hilarious as his friends usually did? Would his banter and ideals just leap onto some billboard? When would he arrive at the new audition for his talents? Was he not scuttling any plans of safety and prestige by dropping out of college and beginning to write songs? Right. Lewis had resented his parents' inability to articulate more than the world outside of high school, with not much curiosity for more than their own steady business for nearly a decade, with Pawpaw Green and on their own, and even in partnership with Grandpa and Grandma King, who were not always practical. In fact, while they were kind, if basically strict enough, their ways reminded Lewis to be more proud of Senior because he had tried to be a better family man and show more business sense than he had learned before. He loved them, but never had quite the connection with them his sister had. Maybe it was the cigarette smoke and the strange men that came around for his aunts, the funky smells, the even worse roaches, and the lack of privacy would have made him actually interact with his cousins. He was lucky to remember a few by name and memory. Mostly it was his need to live in his own world, out behind the trailer, out of sight and tucked away in his room. When he had now discovered he needed to find his awareness of the world outside, his fear of that world had sabotaged him and made him cling too much to what some romance offered in the past as he took his continued success rather for granted after an easy time in high school. Except where he had simply not applied himself. Not doing what seemed hard had only led to diminished will. What makes a little time with his parents then so hard? Hadn't he racked up enough self aggrandization for now to just put them first a minute? And that, nevertheless, he was going to have to figure out this life for himself. And really, his parents were guilty of nothing more or less. "I've got a surprise for you," Mom said, walking out with a hobbling gait, smiling. "It's something really old." He personally had too acute a habit of not giving a shit much about old things Mom brought out. He had yet to accrue much nostalgia for his earlier life, as if aggrieved by the shackles of it. Hmm. Its inoculated ignorance of how to function beyond the stop sign, beyond which he was forbidden to walk, and sense of both vice and intelligence denied by a church centric culture which had already declared war for the right ideas long over, save for whatever newfangled gadgets would come out before the rapture. He followed her over to the former addition to the old trailer, the old den and bedroom, where many things remained stored. "I found this over at your granddad's when they moved to town," Mom said, stepping out onto the progressively stacked cinder blocks. "You'll never guess what it is." He was sorry his interest seemed feigned. Whether he was humoring her, patronizing her in a supercilious manner, or sincerely interested, she never seemed to differentiate. Perhaps she didn't really care, and they would have a much harder time if she was as judgmental of his actions as he had felt while on board with her. He remembered his sweetheart and decided anyone so lucky should lighten up. She picked up a little green book, locked on the front. An old journal of yours? He asked. He'd kept one of his own for the last 2 years of high school. My mother's diary, she beamed. She opened it. Look at that, the year she and your pawpaw got together. That must really mean a lot to you, he said with feeling. Her mother had been dead 3 years and suffered Alzheimer's and constant dementia nearly the entire time he had known her. You mind if I flip through it, Mom? Go ahead, she offered. Did you read the whole thing? He asked, opening his grandmother's pages carefully. The spine was cracked, though all the pages remained inside. It's not real long, she replied. I hate it she quit writing in it. I think he was already stationed in Fort Benning for some of it. He began to understand the dates that were listed individually, not necessarily corresponding to the printed ones offered. Lewis set aside a box filled with tapes of the Bible as read by Alexander Scorby, unless they were taped over with songs Denise liked on the radio. He read the first page, her New Year's Day. Her boyfriend, his grandfather Green, called to tell her that he'd have a weekend pass from Fort Benning. She didn't write in it every day, Mom drawled, but it's got some things I never heard back when they first fell in love. Lewis made a makeshift seat to lean against. I'd like to look at it for a bit. All righty, I'll go let your daddy know you're here and see what he wants to do tonight.